Looking back on the relationships I've had, I think it's quite possible that almost all of my relationships were with survivors of sexual abuse. I think the thing that made those relationships different from each other is that there were different levels of awareness in me that my partner had been abused, and there was different levels of awareness in them that they had been abused. I think statistically, when you look at the likelihood that 1 in 3 women were sexually abused before the age of 18, that's a huge number of individuals. The numbers are probably very similar for men, they're just underreported. The first thing that comes to mind for me, actually, I don't know what you feel about this, I think there might be a perfect storm of dysfunction in male-female relationships in terms of the fallout from sexual abuse, particularly surrounding sexuality. The first thing that comes to mind for me is that I often regarded my sexual desirability or my need to have sex as being a symbol of my self-worth. There was often a perfect storm in relationships where I felt loved through sexual connection and the partner who I was with felt awkward or uncomfortable having sex. So it was a perfect mess in a sense. There was a situation where the very thing that I felt comforted, secure, connected and loved in doing was exactly the same thing that my partner felt confused, threatened, uncertain and insecure around. I think that was probably a dynamic that plays out in a lot of male-female relationships. I think culturally, the male is led to believe that their self-worth is based on their propensity to have sex. I can remember relationships years ago where I was very reluctant to accept that I had been sexually abused. It wasn't something that I reflected on or connected with. I was sold this idea by our culture that somehow this idealized sexual connection would bring me a sense of completeness and wholeness that was lacking in me. That seemed to be promised by the culture, this idea of this relationship or someone saving me. I remember this movie, Jerry Maguire. The 2 lead characters are in an elevator together and there's this deaf couple in the elevator and they sign to each other, and then Jerry Maguire asks the woman that he loves in the film, what did they just say? And then she says, they just said, you complete me. And in the film it's depicted as this romantic ideal, this idea that there was a missing part to each person and the other person would somehow fill in or complete this sense of absence, which I think in my experience is a very dangerous idea. I think stable connection relies on each person being complete and wishing to share themselves in that completeness with another. However, the cultural ideology suggested very strongly to me that I needed to find someone to complete me.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I definitely remember, I guess for me it felt less about sexuality and more about finding love. When I was 13 or 14, I just remember feeling, not that I even particularly wanted to be in a relationship or something, but just like this enormous pressure of that was the thing that was always missing in my life, a relationship or love. But I guess that's because I wasn't feeling loved.
Did you feel it had a big influence on you that there were loads of Disney characters singing stuff like, someday my prince will come, and all this kind of idea of this missing aspect that was a kind of knight in shining armour?
Yeah, definitely feeling like there was a lack. I remember going through a phase when I was a teenager where I was just like, oh my goodness, this is like the one thing that I'm never going to be able to have or be able to have. One goal of finding a relationship. Do
you feel like our culture, in a general sense, wounds children to the point that they feel there's a deep absence and then tries to sell that absence back to them as a product, as in this romantic ideal?
I think so, definitely. I guess I feel like it brings a certain status as well, because especially as a teenager, there was always this pressure. It just felt like people would always ask you about relationships that you were having and stuff like that. If you're a victim of abuse, that whole topic surrounded with anxiety.
Talking about the impact the culture has on our expectations surrounding relationships and to the extent that it models or creates an ideal which we have to fulfill in our society. Have you ever seen the movie The Little Mermaid? Yeah, I find this movie very interesting. I rewatched it recently. It seems to tell a very interesting narrative, which I think is slightly corrupted by the Disney version of it. But anyway, the narrative seems to be this mermaid, this female being, is in a kind of magical world under the sea, and she emerges into the world of men, and she's given legs. She's allowed to move around, but the condition under which she is allowed to move around in the world of men is that she cannot speak. For me, that seems like quite a strong metaphor for the ways in which the feminine's been oppressed in our society, the way in which the feminine being was allowed to participate in the society of men as long as she was quiet. But it also, at least in the Disney version, is quite a troubling story because it does imply there's this missing part to her and she has to find this male aspect external to her. Whereas I feel like the problem in our society is that the aspect that many of us are looking for, whether male or female, our divine feminine or divine masculine aspect, is not outside of us, it's inside of us. We're seeking to fill a hole that's somewhere within our psyche, or in other words, our spiritual core, and we're invited to find that missing piece outside of us instead of inside of us. Do you think that's accurate?
Maybe the ideal state to be in is one where you feel just comfortable and happy with yourself. It's like that with a lot of areas of our life. We don't need these things to complete us. You just need to be centered in yourself, and all these other things, they're just external things. And then I think maybe a shift happens where you're not seeking these things to fill this hole and you're in a state of peace. Things will maybe just come to you.
It's like Obi-Wan tells Darth Vader in Star Wars, I'm paraphrasing, but he says, the more you reach out and grab, the more star systems will slip through your fingers. For whatever reason, our reality works in a similar way. It does feel like when we grab for things, they tend to disintegrate. And when we wait peacefully and explore gently, they tend to be more likely to come our way. I think there's a slight difficulty in this idea, and that is that a survivor of abuse often feels like they have had to be rigidly independent, that they have not to rely on anyone else, that they have to find their own way, and that they have to be self-sufficient in every sense, because from the very moment they were born, they were self-sufficient. So I feel like there's a complex nuance here, and that is that on one hand, it feels like a healthy, independent human being is whole and complete in themselves and does not seek desperately to find someone to complete, stabilize, or help them. Mm-hmm. However, some of those traits, independence, stability, being alone, are also symptoms of social discomfort or someone who's been very, very hurt. I feel like for me, the way the system ideally should work is that a child is given unconditional love, support, independence, trust. As a result, they learn to develop those qualities in themselves, and then they're let go into the world as a complete human being. However, I think the problem is we have so many people who are deeply wounded. Huge numbers of us are walking around essentially with massive wounds in our sides, just pouring blood out everywhere. But because these wounds are psychic, they're not so easy to see. Because they exist within the psyche, they're not so easy to see. So I feel like there's a lot of walking wounded about the place who do need connection, who do need love. But the tricky balance is to support and love a survivor without fostering a dependence. It's very dangerous, I think, to become the missing piece for a survivor of sexual abuse. And I think that is the difficult line that you tread when you support or love someone who has experienced sexual abuse. What do you feel about that sort of delicate line between supporting and loving a survivor versus becoming overwhelmed by their need to fill a hole in them with you? Have you had experiences of helping or supporting people who you felt have overstepped a boundary in terms of overwhelming you, I guess, with their needs?
A friendship that I had where on the surface level we had similar interests, but on a more unconscious level, a dynamic being repeated, linking back to my mother. The dynamic was I felt like I wanted to help her and make her see about abuse that was happening, abuse that happened to me, abuse that I felt like she had been through a lot of the things that she was saying, a lot of warning signs that she was talking about, the way she talked about her family. Yeah, so I guess there was this want to help her get through this, to help her get through her struggles. But what I didn't see was that, and this is what I could not see with my mother because I was a child, both of these people were very manipulative and would use vulnerabilities like saying how hurt they were to get attention and to get love from me. And I just did not realize that they were saying these things to manipulate me. And in the end, I feel like it was this sort of friendship. There weren't enough boundaries, little things that I didn't pick up on. She would just come over to my house unannounced, just expected me to help her with something. And I was like, oh, I sort of explained it to myself like, oh, that's really spontaneous, that's fine, like that's just how she is. I didn't really feel like I had a choice in it. And I kind of felt sucked into something then, and I felt like I had to please her all the time, which I guess was like with my mother as well. And it ended up really dangerously.
And you feel free to describe what happened if you want.
It ended up really dangerously because I just could not. And this makes me feel really angry, actually, because it's something that I've noticed with my dad and this pattern repeating. There's some things that I'm becoming more aware of them now, thank God, because I have to become more aware of these things, because I've basically, as a kid, given no skills to identify dangerous people. So I'm just basically being like eaten by all these wolves the whole time, because I've got no idea of seeing that is a wolf. And that's precisely because both of my parents were wolves, really angry wolves, and yet I had to completely suppress all the anger that I felt towards both of them and form some kind of sick connection, sick on their part, normal on my part, because you have to be connected to your parents to survive, but it means that you don't see obvious things that are happening. There is like a wolf. It was like that with this friend in particular, and something really bad, really terrible happened, which again makes me feel a lot of shame because I feel like, how could I not see this? Like I feel like it's my fault that I keep getting into these kind of relationships where I just expect it to be like this platonic friendship, which is always my expectation, and then it's just this horrible violence came out of it.
I think when a child is raised within a family with aggressive, abusive, sexually abusive people, then it's very hard for them to find a new way of relating to people. And we'll discuss this more later, but there's obviously a phenomenon called the compulsion to repeat, which was identified by psychologists. What the compulsion to repeat is, we're unconsciously drawn to situations in the present which resemble traumatic situations in the past. The idea being that we unconsciously seek to resolve those patterns of behaviour, or that the mind keeps compelling us to revisit and heal those traumas. But very often in seeking out the same patterns of relationship, we simply repeat the past. And that's the very difficult thing about this process, and I can identify it in myself. I think it's very difficult for many survivors to acknowledge that throughout their lives they have been unconsciously drawn to very damaging relationships, because the relationship model that was established for them, the ways in which they know how to relate, were dysfunctional because of the original abuse they experienced. And it's very easy to fall repeatedly into the same pattern. However, I do not hold you responsible for that, and I think it's unhealthy, although understandable, for you to hold yourself responsible for that. Although the dynamic plays out because one individual has been wounded and the other one most likely has been wounded too, but seeks not to heal and not to reflect, but to reenact and feel power through that reenactment. I think there's a danger there, and I do think that the fault does lie with the aggressor. It's every individual's responsibility to reflect and understand their past and not to repeat it.
I was reflecting on this with reference to this fictional series Twin Peaks, because I think that does go into this childhood abuse quite well. What I think is particularly difficult in my case, and maybe other survivors, is that I agree there is this compulsion to repeat. I feel like maybe I was seeing Vanessa as my mother, and I wanted, instead of sexual abuse to be enacted, for me to tell her about it and for it to stop. I definitely understand and see this idea of the compulsion to repeat, and it definitely played out in the sense that I felt like with this friend, I wanted for it, unlike in the past with my mother hurting me and perpetrating sexual abuse on me, for it to end differently. So for me to go to my friend and tell her what was happening, and for it to stop, to not have this dynamic. But I feel like what makes it particularly hard, in maybe my case and other survivors, is that because dissociation was the main way of surviving as a child, if something happens to you, you're not even aware of it enough to defend yourself in any way. So you just go into the shutdown, freeze state. And
so you feel like the friend you're describing, she was sexually abused as a child and then unconsciously repeated that sexual abuse in her relationship with you.
I don't think it was unconscious. I mean, from her part, I think it was conscious, because this is the thing, I think this is really important. I did not want to be in a friendship with someone that was going to abuse me. I had no sexual interest in her whatsoever. I just wanted a friendship. That was how I felt about it. And I think from her part, no, there was conscious motive there. She prepared all these materials to bring with her to hurt me. I think when someone makes that decision to act violently, then it's a decision. It can't just be excused as some kind of unconscious repetition of something.
People who enact abuse should be fully held to account. What I'm curious about is, do you think she was conscious, not of what she was doing at that point in time? I would agree, based on knowing you and having heard your description of this experience in the past, I would say she's fully conscious of what she was doing. I'm curious, and perhaps it's hard for you to answer, do you think she was conscious of that having been done to her?
No, because I feel like, I guess this is the thing with most abusive people. I feel like if they were able to go back and feel what it felt like to be abused, to feel the pain and the helplessness and all those things about having that happen to you, you would not be able to commit an act of violence. You would not be able to hurt someone else in that way, because you would have empathy for the victim. And in that moment of abuse, there is no empathy. There is no understanding of what that feels like for the victim.
Yeah, I agree. In terms of psychodynamics, if any listeners are interested, from my understanding of the situation, and this is aside from the pain and terror of actually experiencing it, which is a completely different thing, but to look at the mechanics of what's happening, as I understand it, what happens as a sexual abuse survivor myself, I think this is accurate. What happens is that those who sexually abuse or violently attack other people are unconsciously repeating the original trauma they experienced, so they're unconsciously repeating something that was done to them, except they're diffusing the emotions that they feel about that experience by casting themselves in the role of the aggressor and casting someone else as the victim. Therefore, they get to feel strong and powerful, and they get to diffuse their emotional capacitors, in a sense, by vicariously forcing someone else to feel the emotions they should be feeling for themselves. And that, in essence, is the cycle of trauma. The way in which those who were abused become abusers if they do not face the pain and confusion and fear of having been abused. And I think our society largely does not encourage people to face the original trauma. Our society is so deeply unconscious on this issue. You can see it being played out in the court systems. When someone attacks someone and is brought to court, the court does not acknowledge the fact that that person is most likely reenacting earlier abuse. That does not excuse what they did. It does not mean they would get a lighter sentence for whatever it is that they've done to someone else. But it does mean there's a fundamental problem here. And that is that for some reason our society has decided that people do things for no reason. It has decided that people for absolutely no reason attack other people. And I think that's the biggest problem, to completely ignore the historical basis on which people behave in the ways that they do. It deeply puzzles me. You don't have to, but how would you feel about describing what it was that you experienced in terms of the abuse that you were subjected to by this individual? The value in doing it, I would say, is that they rely on your silence, and I feel like whoever did it to them relied on their silence, and I feel like it's time to break that cycle.
It's time to break that cycle, and it's time to not be ashamed because I haven't done anything wrong. These things were done to me. Well, we went to the forest collecting herbs, and we had a really nice day. And then there was a point where we were just sat down, and she took me to one side into a different part, tied my hands with rope and threatened me with a knife, and basically was raping me. Yeah. I had no control or no power to do anything to stop it. I just feel like maybe it's important to say that I feel like there's a strong link, and I think this is not many people are aware of it. All these materials like ropes and chains and things like that are often used to torture children, and then they seem to come up again in a different form in like romantic relationships or sexual relations like that. And I think I find it particularly disturbing as a survivor, because for me those things just symbolize abuse and violence in these situations, in this friendship. Well, I thought it was just a platonic friendship, but then it was used to hurt me.
I think it's a very accurate observation. I feel like because our society is so deeply unconscious of the most basic psychology, it does not understand that people often reenact unconsciously trauma they were subjected to. See, this is the depth of the unconsciousness. I feel like what I'm about to say is going to surprise some people, hopefully not those people who have any understanding of depth psychology, but I feel like the entire S&M scene, the entire scene of sadomasochism where people voluntarily tie other people up and subject them to pain, I feel that these people, without exception, are unconsciously reenacting abuse they were subjected to as children. I believe that unequivocally. And if anyone wishes to dispute that, I would happily sit with anyone. I'd happily sit with them and have a conversation for an hour. And I think it would be very likely that we would see through that process, that we would see through their compulsion to enact those behaviours.
What happened was 100% rape. It was like there was no ambiguity in any way. It was like that. And I think with the S&M thing, I think the difficulty is that it appears, well, it is consensual in a way. Say it's different from what happened to me in that way, but I also, that isn't to say that I still think these things are really disturbing and like worries me a lot to see that, because like you said, there's a clear link there between reenactment and the past.
Yeah. My view on the S&M scene is that it is consensually non-consensual, as in the adult in the present participating in it has given consent. However, their consent was not based on a full awareness of their past. And so in a sense, it's consensually non-consensual, because had that person been fully aware of the reason why they feel compelled to enact these behaviours, typically the reason is they're abused as children using the very same objects that have become a fetish for them because of associative conditioning. Associative conditioning is where we unconsciously pair stimulus and response. In other words, certain objects or ideas are paired with stimulus response. So if you have a certain sexual fetish, if you associate your sexuality with a certain set of behaviours, the question is, in which way and why have those behaviours been paired? Psychologists and neurologists say what wires together fires together. So for example, if someone has a fetish surrounding being tied up, then the question would be, how has being tied up and sexuality become wired together in that human consciousness? I don't want this to sound threatening or confusing for anyone, because I want to approach this topic with compassion and gentleness, but I believe that if anyone participates in this behaviour, I think the most important question to ask is, how did these things become associated? And if they did become associated through acts of violence in childhood, is it really consensual in adulthood to repeat those behaviours, being unconscious of the original reason for those behaviours, which was abusive? In a sense, I feel like there's many people reenacting vague pantomimes of what they were subjected to as children. And I'm not sure that anyone would actually consent to that, given the original reason for that pairing of materials.
I'm just going to ask Phoenix a few questions now, which might help some survivors understand more problems in relationships. Are there any particular difficulties you faced in relationships?
I mean, I would say relationships for me have been universally difficult. I mean, my foundational relationships with my parents were set the tone for all my future relationships. And I think a lot of people dismiss Freud, for example, but I think despite the fact he went off on some wild cocaine binge, I do feel like initially he had some amazingly enlightened theories. And I think it's become a bit of a cliche that a psychologist says, tell me about your parents. Because I feel like the key to so much of our behaviour is that, in a sense, I guess I've unconsciously many times remodeled my relationship with my mother and father through my relationships, and that relationship was not a healthy one. It was one in which I was deeply hurt. So I think I've always been drawn unconsciously to relationships where there was a wounded but aggressive female, and I would often find myself trying to appease them. Conversely, I also felt very lost and without foundation in myself, so I would often look for someone else to support me, but I would keep choosing people who were unable to do that. And plus, no one should really do that. That should have been done for me as a kid. And it's only been really in distancing myself from relationships for a while and really building the foundations so that I don't feel lonely when I'm alone, that I feel like I might be approaching a point where I can have authentic relationships, where I don't need anything and I'm not partnered with someone who needs anything, and I don't feel controlled or disrespected.
Can you describe the link between common problems survivors face within relationships and how these are linked to the abuse?
I feel like so many of my behaviours were patterned after my mother's behaviour. Not only was I attracted to people who unconsciously, on some level, replicated my mother's distance and inability to connect deeply with me, but I think I also took on some of her behaviours. Behaviours like becoming very vague and distant when I felt threatened or attacked, repressing my anger. And my mum did not repress her anger. I think I learned as a kid because my mum was so violent. I mean, she literally beat me till I was unconscious. I feel like I learned not to express any strong emotions. And I think it's very hard to be in a relationship if you're not emotionally honest. But now that's changed for me. I mean, in acknowledging these things, in literally speaking these words, I've become much more connected to myself.
Can we develop more compassion for ourselves when having difficulties in relationship?
I've got a really good formula for this that I developed over several years in my workshop. And the formula is that you imagine that you are your own parent, except not the parent you had, but one that is kind, compassionate and loving. And it's taken a while to be able to do this. But it means that when I feel sad or confused, I don't do what I used to do and what my parents used to do, which is dismiss me or push me away. Instead of that, I imagine, what would I do if I was a kind parent? So if I feel sad, I'll take myself for a walk. I'll read a book that I enjoy. I'll make myself some tea. I'll be more aware of my needs rather than getting angry at myself for feeling emotions that I don't feel like I should be feeling. I think as a kid, my emotions were heavily managed, because I was only allowed to express a small repertoire of emotions. If I got angry, then I was violently abused. If I got sad, I was pushed away. It's taken me a while to learn not to do those things to myself. So I think it's very much been a process of reparenting. And I think many survivors will find huge benefit in being the best parent they can to themselves.
How can people, society, become more aware of the difficulties survivors face in relationships?
I think so many people have been affected by sexual abuse. So many people are survivors. It feels like asking the question, how can society better deal with relationships? I think the most beneficial thing that society can do to become more aware of the needs of survivors is to understand that huge numbers of society who were also sexually abused have themselves become predators in various ways. They've become aggressors. Some survivors have become, like you described, in a sense, lambs, maybe. And I mean that in an affectionate sense. I mean, a lot of us are very gentle and caring, and we are looking for affection. But we also attract those who are very aggressive and exploitative. I feel like the greatest gift that society could give survivors is to acknowledge how many members of society are aggressors and what steps they can take to resolve that problem, what steps they can take to reflect that many of the standards by which society rewards us, wealth, fame, etc., these trophies are largely given to vampires. We largely give our trophies in society to vampires, to those who have hoarded the most money, to those who have become such huge narcissists that they've attracted the most attention. And we give trophies to these vampires. I have no deep hatred for vampires. They're stuck in their own dynamic, but I think it would be really amazing if a few of these individuals who have done this to society could reflect and take steps to acknowledge their role in this abuse dynamic.
Can you explain the psychological phenomena of displacement and how that can cause problems in relationships?
Yes, the psychological process of displacement is where someone takes emotions and feelings that they have for one person and places them on another person. A good and typical example of this is where someone had an abusive, aggressive father, and then in their partner, simply because they resemble the male figure in some vague way, will displace all those feelings onto that person. But it also happens within families. For example, one of the parents who goes to work might be being attacked at work by someone who's angry and aggressive. They will then feel unable to stand up for themselves at work, will go home and displace those feelings of anger onto a child. In other words, displacement is where you take the feelings that you feel for one person, you take them geographically to another location, to another person, and you place them on that person. And I think it happens a lot in intimate relationships. It happens a lot to survivors. Often those who have been violently sexually abused, who feel unable to confront their father or feel unable to confront their mother, will confront their partner for things that that partner has no power over and is not responsible for. I think it's very, very common that a lot of anger and aggression in relationships is displaced from the parents because our society has such a strict taboo on speaking out against parents. And I've experienced this in the worst ways imaginable. I've seen very vividly how many different friends of mine have taken anger that really should have been directed at those who abused them and placed it on me simply because I'm willing to listen and understand. Yeah. And I think that's something that partners of survivors, whether they're survivors themselves or not, but partners of survivors, I think it happens both ways. It's not like any survivor is immune to this, but it's just I think it's very upsetting when finally you meet someone who you feel a depth and connection with and then they attack you. But I think the paradox of it is that attack often comes because of the intimacy, because of the love, because of the connection, because that person actually feels safe to displace those feelings. So it's another sad but understandable storm of love and dysfunction.
Can you explain what projection is?
Yeah, projection is not entirely dissimilar from displacement, but it is, instead of displacing the feelings you have for one person onto another person, you displace feelings that you feel in yourself onto someone else. For example, if you feel angry, you might accuse your partner of being angry. It's essentially that. It's essentially disowning emotions that you feel in yourself and placing them on someone else and then attacking them in that other person. Very, very educational and useful process for survivors and partners of survivors to be aware of these two processes, among others. That is displacement that we just discussed, and also projection, which is another process of disowning emotions. I think disowning of emotions is a big problem generally in relationships, and generally because so many people have been hurt. I think we're not taught largely as kids to feel and process our own emotions, and so as adults we often just we're kind of wild lawn sprinklers, pumping out different feelings in different directions and accusing other people of feeling them. It's hard territory to navigate.
Can you explain what transference is?
Yeah, transference is another psychological term, and this often happens within the therapist-patient relationship, although it can happen within intimate relationships because in essence many of those relationships are to some extent therapeutic. What transference is where you take the character and core essence of a person who often hurt you in the past and you mistake the person you're with in the present for that person. So psychologists often observe this. For example, I mean, since we're talking about the topic of abuse, a practical example of this might be that the patient will unconsciously begin to react to the therapist as if they are an abusive father figure, for example, and they will begin to transfer all of the essential meaning of that person's character and personality onto the therapist. But this can also happen in intimate relationships. It's not entirely different from displacement. There is some crossover there. It's essentially where you mistake unconsciously the person you're with in the present for someone who deeply affected you in the past.
What is narcissism and how does that play a role in relationships?
Narcissism is a form of energy vampirism. What I recommend listeners do is go onto YouTube and have a look at Meredith Miller's videos on narcissism because they provide a much more substantial and interesting roundup of this topic than I can provide on this podcast because it's an enormous topic. What strikes me most about Meredith Miller's videos is that although she describes these individuals as narcissists, as those who in essence feel like they need to grab energy and meaning from their interactions with other people rather than provide that energy for themselves, what surprises me is how much this dynamic echoes the mythological phenomenon of the vampire. And I feel like the narcissist is a euphemism, a modern euphemism for the vampire, except whereas a vampire in the myths bites your neck and draws out the blood, the narcissist in our reality can't literally do that. We have laws that prevent that. However, energetically, they can do pretty much the same thing. And I highly recommend those videos. I think every sexual abuse survivor has, in essence, been bitten by a vampire, and perhaps several vampires. And just as in the vampire myth, you have to take serious steps not to become a vampire yourself, or not to become a victim to more vampires. I think it's very, very worthwhile, and perhaps one of the most worthwhile things, to take a look at those videos and other videos on YouTube about the subject of narcissism and understand the ways in which that affects your life, because it affected mine deeply, and I think it affects many survivors' lives.
What is triangulation, and how does that play a role in relationships?
Triangulation is a narcissistic tactic. In essence, it's something that vampires metaphorically do to those that they feel like they have been seen by, in a sense. So what a narcissist may do is triangulation. Triangulation is where you tell one or more other people something about another person in order to destabilize, confuse, or suppress that other person. The example that's used most online is the flying monkeys from The Wizard of Oz, where the Wicked Witch of the East, I think, East, West, it's always a bit of a mystery, sends out flying monkeys to attack Dorothy. In essence, what triangulation is, or this flying monkey technique, and I speak about this with a sense of understanding. I do understand these vampires are very hurt, but what in essence is happening is that the vampire, or the narcissist themselves, or the abuser themselves, feels like they can disguise their attack on those they're abusing by sending a third party to attack. And that could be by spreading gossip, rumours, misinforming, or simply finding ways to attack and destabilise another person without attacking them directly. In essence, manipulating other people to abuse the person they wish to abuse. Yeah.
What is the role of consent in relationships?
Consent is obviously, as we all know at this point in history, it's essential. I mean, it's the very core of every connection that we have. If there is not consent, there is no relationship, there is only abuse. I've noticed there's a problem. Maybe let's quickly look at the history of it, and that is that until very recently in many countries, it was not illegal to rape your wife. I mean, that's actually unbelievable to me, that until very recently in many countries, it was not illegal to rape your wife. I'm talking about developed Western nations. I mean, that's kind of shocking. So we had a system whereby a certain legal status as a man gave you permission just to rape your wife whenever you wanted, and there would be no consequence to that.
What is the role of Hollywood-induced romantic delusion in the dysfunctional structuring of modern relationships?
I do think there's a big problem with the way in which our media and film and television depicts romantic relationships. It does formulate these relationships in which often the female figure is lost, confused, and abandoned until she finds the male counterpart who saves her. The interesting thing about this myth, and I think it permeates fairy tales, it's not necessarily a modern Hollywood concoction. It's something that does pervade other forms of art that predate Hollywood by centuries. But I think what the confusion is that these myths do not represent a literal necessity. They do not represent the need to find the missing male or female aspect in someone else in another physical form. I think what they represent is the psychological imperative to find within yourself as a human being your masculine and feminine aspects, and to unite those aspects in balance. I was looking the other day in a ceremonial space at a very interesting symbol, and it was, I believe, the Star of David, although it obviously represents many other things in many other cultures. But the interesting thing about this symbol is that it, to me, looks like the divine feminine and the divine masculine combined. The universal archetypal symbol for the divine feminine is a downward facing triangle. The universal archetypal symbol for the divine masculine is an upward facing triangle. If you overlap these two triangles, it produces the Star of David, which is obviously also used in many other religious contexts and outside those contexts. But I feel like this symbol for me represents something very, very important, and that is the balance between the divine masculine and feminine. And I think many of these stories, these fairy tales, and even these very misguided Hollywood movies do seek to present a truth, and that is that there should be a balance between these aspects, between the feminine contemplation, the feminine creativity, reflection, self-understanding, and the divine masculine aspect, not male, masculine aspect of action. And I feel like when these two things are combined, when compassion is combined with action, then you have balance. And I think at that point, our planet will be in a much better position. That doesn't mean looking for a prince in armor, and it doesn't mean looking for a maiden with long hair and a big tower. It means finding within yourself this balance and taking action with compassion.
Just this idea that you look for someone else to like, as if people are just there to fulfill your needs. That's so wrong in itself, this idea. People are sovereign in themselves, and they're not there just to complete you. But then I guess also at the same time, all humans need connection, all different types of connection as well, not just focusing on romantic relationships, but really you can be so happy and secure in yourself if you just have good relationships, even if that's just with yourself or with nature, and then building from that. The dictionary defines slavery as the application of property law to humans. Is marriage slavery?
Is marriage slavery? I mean, this is, for me, the big question, and also the most challenging one, because I can imagine, as even in you asking that question, so many listeners being, they've got some good reason why marriage isn't slavery. I feel like it works like this. Imagine there's a big war, and hundreds of thousands of people go out to this war. There's going to be a certain percentage of people who come back from that war who say, man, war was great. I made all these friends, and there was camaraderie, and we felt like we were all working together, and we just stormed those places, and it was amazing. And I feel like this is the same thing with marriage. I feel like there's a certain percentage of people who go into this marriage experience and have a really great time. But I feel like it's not because of the marriage. I feel like it's because they were lucky that within that system that was corrupt, in my view, they had a good experience. And I feel like there's a lot of people who are very, very deeply hurt by that experience, as with a war. And I think there's also a certain percentage of people who are also hurt but don't really want to say. Just like with a war, you'll be like, how was the war? They'll be like, yeah, it was good. What happened? I don't want to talk about it. It was good. And you're like, okay, but you don't want to talk about it. Yeah, it was good. And you're like, So I feel like marriage for me is the same thing, because the problem with it is that it is property ownership in disguise for me, because the marriage vows themselves say, I take this man to be my lawful wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forth till death do us part. I mean, that is not entirely dissimilar to the wording of a contract connected to ownership of a house or property. I say it's very, very similar. The nuance here is, can any relationship be authentic and loving if you are compelled to be in it? Can any relationship be authentic and loving if you are compelled to be in it by law? I would think no. Why tie yourself to something you love? Why tie yourself to something you love? I feel if you love something, you should trust it and you should allow it to be free. Presumably people love other people because of who they are, and so much of who they are is tied to their ability to be free and expressive. Although it seems like a good idea, just as it seems like a good idea to pick a beautiful flower and put it in a jar and put it in a house, the problem is that as soon as you do that, the flower fades. The very thing that you sought to capture fades. The very freedom, the very excitement, the very dynamic that you sought to own is destroyed in the ownership. And I feel like at the crescendo of society's missteps, the finale of this wrong-footed dance within relationships is marriage, is the point at which someone says, I want to own what I love.
I agree in that is the case in a lot of marriages, and I feel like that the marriage concept itself is problematic, like you just said with the language. I don't think it's right to want to own someone, but I think there are still, despite all this abuse and terrible things happening in the world and these horrible structures, I feel like there are still good and kind people that would not enter into a marriage for those reasons, and they wouldn't enter into it to control someone else or to want to own them, but more for an expression of their love or something, or to show commitment to someone, which is a different reason.
Yeah, what does that mean? What does that mean to you, commitment?
If you care for someone, then you're there for them for like a long period of time. And I feel like maybe that's what, in the best sense, is what wants to be expressed in that marriage, is that you're there for someone, you know, you're in their life and you care for them for a longer period of time.
I see what you're saying. It sounds like, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like you might be conflating marriage with intimate connection. And I'm not speaking out against intimate long-term connection. I'm speaking out against state-endorsed, legally defined long-term connection. I guess I'm questioning why we need documentation or the state.
I just feel like there's people out there that maybe have not been hurt as much or had more of a stable experience in their younger years that are able to have a marriage relationship that isn't a catastrophe.
If that's you, write to us. We'd love to speak to you. I think probably everyone would like to hear from those people. Where are you? I'm going to find you one day. You happily married people. Where are you? Where do you think they are? Have you seen one recently?
I don't know any married people.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I know some married people who are I guess, happy, but they sort of, I mean, I think they got married like slightly ironically, you know. I don't think it was necessary. I think they maybe wanted a party or something.
Yeah.
I've not seen anyone who...
That's what I mean.
Yeah, but I don't know anyone who's like sort of seriously married who, you know, took it all seriously, who's happy.
Yeah, definitely. Like, especially not if it's the goal of your life or something.
If you're happily married, and I mean really, don't lie to us, really, email us and explain how. Explain how you found love within the rigid structures of the state.